Today's event is about us coming together to again look at the situation with visa fees, the extortionate cost, the lengthy processes, complicated processes, and the long path to settlement, the impact on migrants and the implication, and discuss and look at why do we need a complete overhaul of the visa system in the UK, and why do we need a fairer migration, fairer system for migrants altogether. The way migrants have been treated in the past few years is so unfair. I mean, we had COVID come in, we have people struggling, losing jobs, losing, their working hours reduced, struggling with the stress, with the pandemic, and at the same time, we had the migrants on top of all this worrying about, raising huge sums of money in the middle of a pandemic, in lockdown, just to pay for their visa fees so they don't become undocumented. And almost no one cared. We have now a cost of living crisis. You've seen people on the streets, all these demonstrations, people need more, higher salaries, need better conditions. People are struggling, they're going to food banks. Amongst these people are tens of thousands of migrants who are also working and struggling like everybody else. After all, they are also families and human beings, and they are people who actually left their countries and came here to look after us, to support us, to work here and to set a home here. They also, on top of all this, they need to come up with a huge sum of money, and they used to go through complicated, horrendous processes, and they have to wait sometimes years and years, keep paying money over a long time of years before they are allowed to settle in. And I think this is not just unfair. I mean, it's wrong. And this is why we're here today to discuss together how do we move this work forward. But, and I'm delighted to have a very distinguished panel today to help us start setting the context for the day. But before that, I'd like to invite my colleague Anne to tell us a little bit about our campaign, why we set it up, and what we're trying to do. So Anne, over to you.
Hello, everybody, and welcome. And it's lovely, as Nazek said, to see a full room packed with people in person, in 3D. I'm Anne, I'm from Migrant Voice, and as many of you know, we've been campaigning for some time now with members affected by long settlement routes and high extortionate visa costs to call for change. And in our campaign, we raised the kind of things Nazek just mentioned, that it's not just about immigration status, it's not just about the cost, but it's the cost on every level of people's lives. Our work lives, home lives, housing, health, personal finances, family relationships, and the future, simply because we're here settling in the UK. And as you know already, the amounts people have to pay are extortionate. They're over £5,000 per person on the 5-year route and £10,000 per person on the 10-year route before applying for indefinite leave to remain, just for one person. A lot more if you have a family of multiple people. And what makes it so unfair, not just extortionate, but is the shocking thing that we're not really paying for the cost of processing our visas. We're paying for 7 to 10 times that cost. So it's deeply unfair, and as Nazek mentioned just now, we are in a cost of living crisis. And of course, millions across the UK are struggling with rising costs, facing these struggles, not only migrants, but on top of the costs that are going up for everybody, we know that tens of thousands of migrants are also having to come up with these £5,000, £10,000 for visas. And the situation that was difficult before is much worse now. So many of you here today are also campaigning, perhaps on your own, fighting for your own situation or supporting others in their fight. And some of you are new to campaigning, and some of our guests here have been campaigning for decades. Some are from organizations, some are individuals, some are campaigning on distinct issues or for particular groups around settlement or around the 10-year route, what happens to you in your work conditions or living within RPF conditions. And this conference was organized to bring us all together to see what can happen when we come in the room together and discuss this as individuals, as organizations, as people with a history of campaigning or not, to discuss, to share, to ask questions, to learn, to ask questions again, and perhaps generate some better ideas together, coming up with more ways to reach a better and fairer immigration system. We hope that the campaigns and work you hear about today not just Migrant Voices campaign, but all the other campaigns in the room that you'll hear about in workshops and in conversations on the tables, will inspire with what's already being done, will give a little bit of hope that it is possible to campaign for change, but also give ideas and learning for what else we might do together and individually. I want to say a little bit more about Migrant Voice's own campaign. It represents the fact that we are a very diverse membership across the UK in Migrant Voice, affected in different ways by this. Some are on the 5-year route, some on the 10-year route, some have fallen out of these settlement routes. And our campaign is basically calling for visa fees for adults to be no higher than the actual processing cost and the admin cost to process the visa. We're calling for children to not have to pay visa fees at all. We're calling for the routes to be capped at 5 years rather than the lengthy routes that we see now. We want to abolish the immigration health surcharge. And we also want to cut waiting times and improve communication from the Home Office and have a less stressful, much more simplified application process. Our asks are ambitious, but this is what our members wanted, and we think these are the change that is actually needed for a better system. Over the past year and a bit, we've been doing many different things to push for these changes. Firstly, of course, we came together in network meetings and discussion groups, migrants coming together to talk about the effect of the visa application and renewal process and what needs to change, and in the process building the campaign and its asks. We have produced a report on the issue, which we launched in Parliament for MPs and also the Chief Inspector of Borders and Immigration to hear about the experiences of migrants going through this route. We've sent our reports to hundreds of MPs and Lords. Our briefings have been received by MPs from all parties. We've brought the issue to members of the London Assembly, to the Labour Party conference. And our engagement has resulted in early day motions in the House of Commons, as well as parliamentary questions and a plenary discussion in the London Assembly. We've also had support from a number of unions. And there's been a lot of interest and support overall, but we're not there yet. We haven't seen the changes that we want. So we will continue our meetings, training, lobbying, media engagement, and getting the public engaged. We invite you to join us, but we also invite you to speak to the other campaigns of today. You know, join whichever campaign resonates with you, and let's work together so we can change the system through all our collective efforts. Thank you.
Thank you, Anne. Thank you. I mean, I would add we should call to, for the fees to be waived altogether during the current financial crisis and, rise in cost of living. We should be very ambitious of what we want to call for. After all, we pay taxes and we pay all our bills, and so it's not like we're not paying anything. It's just, I can't see the point of this extortion amount that migrants have to pay. But I think since I am maybe the longest serving migrant in the room, it's been a long time when I last paid my fees, visa fees, and that's why today I'm getting the help of Keziah Gitonga, who's still paying fees, to tell us a little bit about how the process for renewing and applying for the visa has been is harder and harder, and what are the implications, the impact on families, and why we really must campaign for a fairer system. So Keziah, over to you.
Thank you. Hi everyone, my name is Keziah, and like you said, we are campaigning for a better deal. I'll just give, in my talk, I'll have a background of how I came to the UK, what the visa system has done to me and my family, and finally I will talk about what I hope for and what I suggest that the powers might be to do. So I moved here when I was 17 in 2002. I came as an economic migrant. I didn't know what that meant at 17 years of age. All I knew was I had to fill applications after applications after. And interesting enough, I came with my family, and I have a twin brother, and his first renewal was denied. In fact, the caseworker said, "We don't believe you came the same route as your family." Now, we came on the same plane, same day, we have the same stamps on our passport, and that's where the nightmare began. And he was given 10 days to leave the country. So we went in thinking, it's a normal renewal. And actually, back then, there was no renewal of visa applications when you're on economic migrant settlement. You just go into indefinite leave to remain. But rules changed and we had to do the limited leave to remain. You pay money, and then for indefinite, you still have to pay money, which was a year or two after. Anyway, thanks to our MP, we were able to revert, and the caseworker apologized. Actually, that's the first time I ever saw an apology. And, you know, they rectified, and my twin brother was not deported. And I remember getting the news that day, and I was really ecstatic. But it hit me different from then onwards, and it made me realize, okay, I need to understand what this immigration business is all about, and how one member of the family can one day be an alien, and the other one, he's here legally. What happens? So in 2002, the visa fees were $260. I didn't have to pay more than that. But now, as we know, the settlement visas are hefty. So I was one of the first people who had to do the Life in the UK test. And that was also, there's a cost to that. And there was not much information of where to do it. In fact, it was only libraries that were offering that Life in the UK test. There was no books and everything like that. What the visa process does not explain is the hidden costs that come with it. It's just not the application process, it's also the hidden costs that come with it. So the first thing was to pay for your own Life in the UK test. So the application process is quite confusing. Do they make it ambiguous by purpose? I don't know. I feel they do, because it's a way to catch people out, so that, you know, if you made a mistake, literally, even if you write your name wrongly, you can actually lose your application. And as we know, your visa fees are non-refundable. Why is that? You know, that's one question, you know, I still don't have answers to. So luckily, I went through the process and I got my citizenship. And I went about life and everything, and I met a handsome man, and we got married. Then the process started again. Now I'm having to pay for his fees for spousal visa, and the whole trauma of waiting and the radio silence is annoying. If I can tell you the kind of thoughts you have every day, it's crazy. So what does that mean to me? Personally, it's starting to show me that love has a cost. And for migrants who've been through the process, it might discourage them to actually form relationships with people who are from different countries. Because once you understand the migration process, you'll be like, why do I want to put somebody else through that process? There's a strain in the relationship, you know, because there's guilt for me who has the citizenship. My husband doesn't. There's constant fear, you know, what will happen. So he's on the 5-year route, and the fees for that was, as Anne has already explained, are already high. But there's the charge for health surge, which actually changed the second time we were renewing whilst he was here. So he's already experienced the change twice. And they're not explaining why the health surge has gone up. Secondly, now we've been waiting for his visa to be renewed since 2021. And the answer we get from the Home Office is because of the Ukraine war. So what does that mean for me? It means every time there's a political shift, I'm affected. And that's why being on the steering committee of the Migrant Voice is very important for me, because we are all interconnected. The situation that's happening in Turkey now and Syria, better believe it's coming to your door. And it will affect all migrants, because the application process will be stalled, changes will happen. And this is the things you don't realize when you're embarking on this journey. So we were told because of the Ukraine war applications for settlement are going to be stalled indefinitely. We don't even know when, how long. Meanwhile, his employer is constantly asking, has your visa been renewed? Those HR emails are worded in very interesting language. And that really affects your mental health. It really affects your planning. You can't even go on holiday, you can't do anything. I'm in perpetual fear every day. So we have a child, and I'm thinking, okay, if my husband's application is denied, that means I become a single parent, because he'll have to move back to his home country if we appeal and it's not successful. It's the constant fear. It's the constant enigma. It's the constant hole. You don't know, you don't have answers. Then comes the wonderful rule that came that now landlords have to check passports to ensure that you actually are here legally. I have no problem with that. The Home Office introduced this process whereby, especially if you're a student or you're on a working visa, there's a way your employer or landlord can check online. And you give them a code and they'll check that your application is in process. That's brilliant. Is it available for all routes? No. On my route, for my husband, you can't. So we've had a problem with the landlord moving because we couldn't prove that actually he's waiting for his application. And it's the constant having to explain to yourself. And also it's embarrassing to have to explain to every single person your situation. I remember when I had to ask for proof from my employer that I've been working there so I can send the bank statements. And this is another thing that actually I never thought about, because the way the work field is changing now, HR used to be one person. You knew who your HR person is. Now it evolved to people, teams, so they have a joint email. So literally when you send an email to your HR, all the people in HR who have access to that email account can see it. So they see your personal information, what you're asking, and then they assign whoever who's going to deal with you. I don't know about you, but I'm a very private person. And you start losing your privacy slowly by slowly on this process. It's not easy for me to speak about my personal life like this, but it's important to put yourself in the ring. I've been fighting for about visa fees for a long time. But when you have to be in the middle, you have to stand and shout, this is why it's important for me to be in the steering committee. And because of my work, I started working with migrants and asylum seekers and went into law. I started gathering a lot of people calling me for, help us with this application. In fact, there's somebody today who's going to court. I have to check after I finish here what's happening. It's the constant fear. And in finishing, what does that in entirety mean? So for me, who has citizenship, that's great, yeah? No, because there's a new law, the National Bill law. So that means I can lose my citizenship as well. So you're never settled. That's the message. You really are never settled. So my suggestions as an individual and being part of the steering committee, yes, is to actually scrap the fees. And if you have to go back to administrative fees, I will give you, actually, the Home Office are really brilliant at being transparent. So they have, you can actually check this online. They publish a visa fee transparency data. You can actually see that. And for indefinite leave to remain is 2,404, but the actual administrative cost is 4,901. So what do they do with the top-up fees? Nobody has ever given me a bill. Actually, I'd love to have a bill to understand what I'm paying for, you know. So I want visa fees for children to be abolished as well. And I want the decisions to stop being more than 3 months. We've been waiting for actually 14 months. Why?
2 years, you mean?
Yeah.
2 years.
14 months now for me. 2021, yeah. And there should be a clear way in housing where you can actually prove that you've applied for your visa. And another thing I found very important, we have ombudsmans who are dedicated to various things like, you know, welfare, employment. We should have one for immigration, because some of the rules they're creating are infringing on our human rights. They are infringing on our way of life. And not only that, they are impacting us in ways we cannot speak of. So thank you for being here.
Well, thank you so much, Keziah, for sharing this with us. I mean, you've described the process as a traumatic. Going through the process is a trauma. I agree with you, and lots of people in the room agree with you. Also, you would think this country needs, you know, hundreds of thousands of workers. You think they want to treat workers nicely, so more of them come and work here. Also, I mean, other countries, just to compare and contrast to the UK, if you make a small mistake on your application, they will pick up the phone because you left your phone or email, and they ask you, oh, can we double check this is not the same as, you know, on your front page? And they correct it and then send you the visa. So what they do is, in other countries, they help you to get the visa. Well, here is a tiny mistake, that's it, you lost all your money, try again. And we had actually been in contact with people who have tried 3-4 times, and those are people who speak fluent English, or English is their first language, and they ended up paying fortune. So, you know, surely there's something wrong. I like your suggestion. I mean, okay, give us a detailed bill, you know, where this money is spent on. But because of the time, I'm going to move to Madeleine Sumption, who's the director of the Migration Observatory. And Madeleine, if in 5 minutes, please, if you can tell us, how did we get here? How did we get here? And you've also done research, Migration Observatory, on the 10-year route. And maybe if you can shed the light on what you found from the research as well. Thank you.
Yeah, of course. Thank you very much for inviting me. The Migration Observatory has been doing research for 10 or 12 years now. And one thing that's really struck me is that the theme of the difficulty that people have navigating the immigration system has become more and more important over that period for many of the reasons that Keziah mentioned. I mean, I think it's clear from when we look at the data that overall, across the board, routes to settlement have become longer and more complicated over the last 10 or 20 years. So 20 years ago, for example, a refugee coming through the asylum system would get indefinite leave to remain immediately, and a partner would get indefinite leave to remain after 2 years. Several of the routes have become longer, so people who didn't qualify for the mainstream family route, for example, but had a human rights reason to remain in the UK, would previously have got discretionary leave in the UK, which is a 6-year route to settlement, and then 2012 that became a 10-year route. So we've seen the overall effect of all of these changes is that actually within both the mainstream routes like work, family and study, and also within the human rights routes, we see an increasing the sort of average time that people are taking to get settlement over the last 10 years or so has increased by several years. And actually the data that we have currently doesn't even include people who are on the 10-year route who will be getting settlement around about now, if indeed they are able to stay on that route and make it all the way through to settlement. The other kind of major, there's been a really big growth in the size of the 10-year routes to settlement in particular. I found this really striking when we did some research on it a couple of years ago in 2021. we found that by early 2021, there was an estimated 170,000 people who were currently on one of the 10-year routes, and that had increased dramatically since 2017. Sorry, I've lost my place in my notes. So I think looking at the 10-year routes in particular, it's no longer, it's often presented as quite a niche route that just applies to sort of a handful of people, and actually this is now one of the major routes in the UK immigration system. So what does this all mean? Well, the length of the routes to settlement has several different consequences. One of them, obviously, is the additional cost. So you've got more applications than you would have done in the past, and then because of the health surcharge, the total cost that people pay over, if you have an adult, for example, on the 10-year route, in total they'd be expecting to pay almost £13,000 in fees over the course of that journey, excluding any legal advice that they may need. And that's around £4,500 more than they would have paid on a 5-year route because of the extra charges. I think there's an important question: why is this? Why have we got such an expensive system? Because the UK is much more expensive than most comparable high-income countries around the world. And I think there are two factors. One is the drive to make the Home Office functions self-funding, which I'll say a little bit more about. And the other one is the NHS charge, which is effectively a double taxation on migrants, in the sense that migrants obviously pay for the NHS in the same way that everyone else does, which is through their regular taxes. But I think there's a sort of easy public narrative that it makes sense to contribute to the cost, that you can do calculations about what the cost is of a person of a particular age coming into the country and using the NHS. And I think it's easy for people to forget that actually they're still paying for the NHS in the way that everyone else does, which is through their income taxes. So the length of the routes to settlement affects the cost. It means that there's a longer period that people have with no recourse to public funds. It creates a longer period of insecurity and a larger number of applications, which then comes with waiting times and restrictions on travel. And really importantly, and this is something that we don't know a huge amount about in the research, is there are more opportunities for people to fall off the route and never complete it, because if they make a mistake in an application, or if they forget to make an application, then they may have to restart the clock and go back to the beginning of the process. So I think from a research perspective, it's very clear that the lengthening routes to settlement have had a negative impact on individuals. And this raises the question, okay, well, what's the policy rationale? Why do we, what's the purpose from the government perspective of having these long routes? And it's interesting because, so temporary status in general is often seen as from a policy perspective, as a sort of probationary period during which, for example, the government can check that someone has an enduring relationship if they're on the family route, or they can hold down a job if they're on the work route. Some countries actually don't bother with temporary statuses at all. So if you're a partner going to the US, which is not necessarily a model immigration system in many ways, those people would be eligible for a green card immediately. And there are a number of countries that don't bother with temporary statuses. They go straight to permanent status, at least for people who are likely to be eligible for indefinitely, like family members. It's unclear what the policy benefit, to me at least, it's unclear what the policy benefit of particularly these very long routes, the sort of 10-year routes, what you get from those last 5 years from a policy perspective. The Home Office has said in legal documents that actually it's really more of a matter of principle, that people ought to have a longer route to settlement if they don't meet the main criteria of the immigration system, rather than sort of trying to achieve a specific goal with it. The other big impact, of course, that it has from a government perspective is it brings in revenue. And I think that there's a really important question when discussing fees on any route. It's easy to think about this particular route and why do people pay these particular fees. The reason for the high fees across the board is driven by, in large part, well, it's driven partly by the NHS surcharge, but it's also driven by the fact that the Home Office doesn't have a lot of money, and it's under pressure to raise money in order to pay for its processing functions more generally. And what this means is that if you get a fee waiver or a fee reduction on one route, it's sort of like squeezing a balloon, in that the Home Office then will be under pressure to make up the money by charging more somewhere else. And so I think if there's, in order to have a discussion about sort of how to deal with the cost of the immigration system for the applicants, it's difficult to do that unless actually you have a broader conversation about the very principle of whether it is in fact applicants who should be paying not just for their own application but for the other stuff that's going on in the immigration system, and how that should be financed, because ultimately if it doesn't come from fees it's got to come from somewhere else, and the Treasury has to agree to that. So that's the sort of backstop, I think, of all of these discussions on fees, and why you need to look, I think, kind of at all of them at once rather than just making the case for it's one specific kind of application. Anyway, I'll leave it there.
Okay.
Thank you, Madeleine. Thank you so much for this. Thank you. My next speaker is Wilf Sullivan, for Race Equality Officer at the TUC. I mean, Wilf, it is not just about employment. I mean, we saw from Keziah's statement earlier that actually the process impact on your housing, on your private life. I mean, mental health, but a big part of it is on employment. So what is the TUC doing to support migrant workers, or what role there is for the TUC, and are migrant workers engaged with the trade unions in general, and do they get the support from them?
Thanks, Nazek. I mean, I could speak for hours on this, but I'm not. But I mean, I think, it's important to, put it in historical and political context, in the fact that, when we talk about migrant workers as if they're somehow, this is a new phenomenon to the UK. The UK has always relied on migrant workers, and until the 21st century, once you came across the border, you were treated the same as everybody else. This idea that actually what we needed to do was to extend, almost like outsource, migration control to every part of our society wasn't a feature of what we had with a migration system. And I think, I'd start at that point, because that's one of the debates that we're beginning to have in the trade union movement about what we need to do. Because actually the migration system isn't just administered by the Home Office. It's administered by people in banks, so you have to check, whether people have status of a bank account. It's by the people in the DVLA, about whether people can have a driving licence, by landlords, by employers. And it's administered, what they're supposed to do is administer a system which is horrendously complicated, in fact so complicated that many Home Office officials don't really understand how the different regulations interact. And the result of it is, in my view, a highly exploitative system in terms of how it impacts on people's lives. And one of the things that TUC has constantly said to the government about regulations is how they create a system where people are constantly vulnerable. And one of the things for us about the long settlement route is about the fact that actually over a 5 to 10 year period, what you end up doing is making people incredibly vulnerable. One, because of actually the problems of dealing with a horrendously complicated system. We've already heard, you make a mistake on your application, then you have to start again, you lose that money. Right? Secondly, many people that are going through the system are not in well-paid jobs. Often they're in casualised jobs, working for agencies, working as self-employed, and so actually, and often working more than one job, and actually trying to cope with that over a sustained period of time is a real trauma for people. And when you see the fact that, we talked a little bit about, okay, the costs are supposed to cover the processes for the Home Office, but the fact that the Home Office in these areas is understaffed, that the way staff are deployed is political, What we've lately heard is that the government have decided that actually they're going to do more workplace checks and workplace raids, which means that Home Office and border staff that otherwise might be checking applications will be taken off that, right? To do this, and it's for show. We've got an immigration system basically that's been built not on the basis of what works or what's reasonable, but about prejudice. So this is a real problem, and for the TUC, we do not think that actually the government's argument that charging these fees is justified because it's about covering the cost of the system. We think that's completely rubbish. You would have to have a visa system anyway, right? Irrespective of migrant workers. If you're as a country, we always know that people from various parts of the world need to apply for visas to come here. Even if they came on holiday, you'd have to have the system. The idea that actually it should be self-sustaining for that part of the system when you already have to have it is just ridiculous. And from our perspective, when you see the actual fees that people have to pay, and we know the targets that are sometimes applied within the Home Office of the money that is supposed to be raised, then I can only describe it as a sort of profit gouging scheme. It really is. So there's no justification for it. There's no justification for the health charges, right? The fact is that people that come here and work have to pay tax and insurance, so they're being double charged for a service that, as I said, already has to be there in terms of an immigration system, because actually that's not just about people that might be coming for work, it's about anybody that comes across the border. What we see in terms of the maladministration of the system or lack of administration of the system is that people are put in, people's position is put in jeopardy constantly. 14 months to get a reply from the Home Office about whether or not your visa's being looked at for renewal is not unusual. That's normal, and I've come across people who've had to wait much, much longer. Yeah, and in that period, of course, if you're unlucky, right, and your employer says, well, you need to prove that that's happening, then you're in danger of losing your job, or your landlord says, oh well, I think I need to check, or you've got to move, I need to check whether you've got a right to be in the UK, then you can't find a house. And I mean, I've had the experience, sometimes it's a bit of an officer, but I've had the experience of ringing up the Home Office to try and find out what the status of somebody's renewal was. And you got no chance, even somebody like me who can be fairly aggressive and pushing, because I'm a trade union official, and go, what the hell's going on? You've got absolutely no chance. It's like, chucking a question into a big black hole. Right, and realising that nothing's going to come out. Now, I mean, from the TUC's perspective, and I'll finish here. We think several things need to change. I mean, one, we would want to see the current regime for costs for visas completely done away with. And if there is a regime for cost for visas, it's a standard cost for anybody, whether you're coming as a visitor on holiday to the UK or whether you're coming. We don't think there's a justification at all for differential fees for people. So we absolutely believe that the health surcharge should be done away with. Why should people have to pay national insurance and tax and still be charged for their health care? And still be in a position where they've got no recourse to public funds anyway, right? So in a way, what the health surcharge is doing is bolstering and creating a private health insurance scheme in this country, for which some people that are here that are paying tax and insurance are forced to participate in. we also want to see a situation where people's employment rights are completely divorced from their settlement, their residential status. You know, because what we see is people being exploited in the labour market, and you know, by unscrupulous employers, and they know it, right? They know the vulnerabilities of people, and they know that people, you know, especially if they're going through that process, are not in a position to challenge them. Because quite frankly, the attitude of in tribunals often is, well, actually, if people haven't gone through the scheme, then actually they haven't got jurisdiction. You know, so you know, people are discriminated against. How can it be right that if they're discriminated against, we say we've got a law against discrimination in this country? Oh, but because you're not a citizen, because you're not a migrant, because you haven't got a settlement scheme, it doesn't matter, right? Employers can get away with it. You know, we've seen the same things around health and safety, where despite the fact that the health and safety executives say in theory, well, actually, health and safety legislation applies to everybody. The reality is that very often, actually, migrant workers find themselves in positions where they're working in unsafe conditions. And I think nothing signified that more than what happened in the social care system during the pandemic, right? When you know, where actually what you saw was actually people described as frontline workers, but mainly, you know, many of them being migrant workers in positions where they weren't getting PPE, they weren't getting the proper kinds of protections that they should have at work, and people died as a result, right? So I'm going to finish by saying this. I mean, I think, you know, one of the challenges for us as the TUC, but everybody in terms of that's working in this field, is to work out how partly we change the narrative around it, and that that we are much more unapologetic, right? That we don't fall for this rhetoric all the time that the government have about good migrants versus bad migrants. You know, that actually we make the point that all human beings need to be treated with dignity and respect, and that actually we can't have a state system which is built on exploiting people that come to this country. I mean, one of the things that, you know, I've seen, not only with this government, but with other governments, is the managed migration paradigm. This idea that people, if people come to the UK, should only be coming to the UK if they make a contribution to the economy, right? And at the same time, you know, if you're allowed to come to the UK to make a contribution to the economy of the UK for the benefit of UK citizens, right, you have a state system which says, and also we're going to exploit you through visa fees, through health surcharges, and you're also supposed to pay tax and national insurance. I think that's morally reprehensible. And you know, and I think, you know, we really need to actually start going on the attack, because I believe that most people in this country, if they understood what was going on, would recognise that it was fundamentally unfair, and wouldn't be prepared to put up with it.
Thank you. Absolutely, and also we have some migrant workers who are leaving the country because work doesn't pay anymore for them in the UK, including people in the healthcare sector where we desperately need them because they think it's not worth it for us. We can go and work elsewhere and make more money. So yeah, this policy doesn't make sense, this process. Thank you. So my final guest, and welcome Bell Ribeiro-Addy, the Labour MP for Streatham, and Bell's been a staunch supporter of Migrant Voice, and last year you hosted us in Parliament to launch this report. If you haven't seen it, please, it's on our website to have a look. So Bell here to tell us about well, some of the work she's been doing to support this, but also, I mean, in this room we are talking among friends and supporters. Where else should we be talking, and what else can MPs do for us? You know, what can Parliament do for us, maybe, and help?
Well, thank you very much, firstly, for inviting me to speak. And I was really, really pleased to host the launch of the report, because I think it's very important to put a human story behind what we're saying. Because a lot of the time when we talk in the House of Commons, we're talking about numbers and figures and how much this costs and how much that costs. And a lot of the time we're not thinking about the people behind it. And I think sometimes the way in which they go about things, they're not even thinking about the cost to the rest of the country. Now, I recently, a couple of weeks ago, we had a debate in Parliament in Westminster Hall about the visa charges and how much they affect individuals, and actually how bad it is for the economy. And MPs there were calling for them to be reduced at least to cost, saying it was scandalous, and making the point actually that it's more beneficial for us as a country, if you're not even going to look at the moral side of it in terms of how it's affecting people and their families. It makes more sense for us to reduce the fees to ensure that people are not living in work poverty and are able to work when they've been invited to the country to do so. Now, I remember many years ago, many years ago, it feels like many years ago, 2011, 2012. I was working part-time for Diane Abbott, Member of Parliament for Hackney and Stoke Newington. I was studying law, and I spent also some time working in an immigration law firm. And that was a time when the hostile environment legislation was going through Parliament. And I remember quite clearly Diane saying to Theresa May that if we change the law in this way, and you know, they were saying it was about making sure that we're making the country unattractive to illegal migrants, what they termed as illegal migrants. I don't believe that anybody is illegal. So when I use the word illegal, I'm referring to what the government says is illegal, what they termed illegal migrants. And she said to them, what you're doing here is going to have the unintended consequence of affecting people who you don't think are illegal, the people that you invite to be here. And, you know, we saw what happened with the Windrush generation, and we've seen what's happened actually with everybody being stuck under this really ridiculous visa scheme and these extortionate costs. It is affecting people that the government have invited to come here, people that they deem to be legal in this country. So this idea that it's about illegal migrants in their view is completely wrong. Now, in 2019, the Home Office made an 800% profit on some of its immigration applications. 800%. Even if you put a little bit on it for some sort of reason that makes sense, but 800% profit on its visa, some of its visa applications, and the settlement visa for relatives were up 450% over the last 10 years. Now, you've heard people touch on the right to a family life, and one of the worst things about some of these visa charges and some of the rules that are put forward is how it affects families. You expect people to come to this country, or the government expect people to come to this country to work, pay these extortionate visa fees, and leave their families behind, as if families are not important, as if we don't have that Article 8 right to a family life. And what people don't realise is that additional fee, because it's not just about you. People don't live individually most of the time. It is about your families as well. Thinking about a family of 4, let's say, or even just a family of 2, or the restrictions they put if you're bringing your spouse over, that minimum income threshold, all of these different things infringing on people's rights, making it more and more difficult, making it more and more hostile for people that you supposedly want to come here, for people that you actually need. Now, you've heard about the bureaucracy and the delays, and all of these things are meant to be put in place for, you know, checks and balances. And there's this really strange idea that there's so many different dodgy things going on in the immigration system, and people might be doing something here or there and jumping and, you know, skipping some of the procedure, but they're not. All that's happening is we have really shoddy people working in the Home Office. You've heard about 14 months waiting list, and working in an immigration law firm, seeing some of this, and actually sitting in the immigration tribunal, where sometimes the Home Office wouldn't even show up to someone they were prosecuting. Absolute disgrace. Now, they may be hard up on their resources, but it's clear that the Immigration and Nationality Department of the Home Office needs to be scrapped, and they need to start again. You will have, and again, this is from people coming to see me as an MP and from my previous work, they will copy and paste a response from somebody else's application, forget to change the name, forget to change the country, and then try and charge you again, making the application for their mistake. It's absolutely ridiculous. And they keep on doing doing these things, and every time they do, and they make these mistakes, and you know, not everybody goes after them. There are some people that do go after them. So if you look at the amount that they've had to pay in compensation, it's high. They've had to pay compensation for some of these. Not everybody goes after them, and they end up spending even more money. So it's a completely illogical system. It's a waste of money. And you know, that they're loading the cost onto families rather than running what would be an efficient system. And you've heard about the NHS surcharge, again, making absolutely no sense. And just to say, the NHS surcharge and the way in which migrants are looked at when they present themselves for health reasons is absolutely wrong. I've got an auntie who's lived here, obviously, much longer than I was born, and I'm not that young. And she, in her older years, and as you know, once you're over 70, going into your 80s, that's when you're going to use the NHS the most. She ended up falling over one day, asked me to go to her house and pick up some things, and she said I should get her passport for her. And I was like, why should I get your passport? She said, because they ask me questions at the hospital about whether or not I have the right to be here. It's absolutely shameful, isn't it? You should be able to present yourself, present your name, present your NHS number, and actually our NHS was built on the backs of migrant labour, quite specifically. It's always relied on migrant labour, but also it was meant to be free at the point of use, and that's a public health issue as much as anything else. Imagine turning people away in a public health emergency just because you don't think they're the right type of person to be receiving medical attention. Not to mention, you know, the rights of a child who may be the child of a migrant being rejected, and how that inflicts on their rights as a child. And just thinking about the child fees, as someone who was born after 1981, when I was born, it was £35. Now you're looking at over 1,000. You know, thanks to the work of a number of different campaigns, PRCBC, Amnesty, London Citizens, Lambeth Citizens in particular, because they're my lot. Amazing work has been done to reduce it to cost for those, or reduce the fees for those who cannot afford it. But the idea that you can be born in this country, two people could be born in the country on exactly the same day, and just because their parents may not have the status at that time, and they may gain it later, will go through life and be uncertain. They may both get to 18 years old, want to go to university, one can, one can't, want to get a car, a driving license, one can, one can't, want to rent somewhere, one can, one can't, born in the same hospital, lived on the same, on the same street, had exactly the same experiences, but deemed different, and one discriminated against, not because of anything they've done, but simply because of where their parents were, and where their parents were born, and what it said on a piece of paper at the time that they were born. And that's absolutely disgraceful. And you know, I think whilst those gains are huge in terms of child citizenship fees, I was really proud to be able to speak about that in the House of Commons and push for it as much as possible. Something has to be done to scrap it, because the idea that being born in this country doesn't make you British and you know, causes the issue with your rights is absolutely, and we know that in many different countries. Now, a lot of the arguments that are put across in terms of why we must do this is that we can't have too many people coming into the country. Now, you would be forgiven for thinking that there are so many migrants in this country. Actually, there aren't that many migrants in this country. There are many people that look like me who are British, or there are more people that look like me who are British, but perceived perhaps to be migrants because we don't have a certain colour of skin. But there are a lot. There aren't as many migrants as you might think, and you'd also be forgiven for thinking that, you know, there are many people seeking asylum here who are not you know, have not regularised their immigration. But actually, when we think about migrants overall, the majority of people in this country who are migrants, as in born somewhere else, are actually, as by the government's definition, legally allowed to be in this country. They are the people that are being charged these extortionate visa fees. And when we're talking about the money and how all of this flows, and what I've realised definitely over the years is the increasing privatisation of the immigration detention estate. Now, we're not talking about, obviously we're talking about visa fees, so we're talking about people that the government deemed to be legal and how much it cost them. When we think about how much money the Home Office seem to need, we have to ask ourselves, why does the Home Office need all this money? Yes, they're an incompetent organisation and they waste a lot of money, we know this, but the fact that they pay literally millions, to the tune of billions over years, to private companies to manage the immigration estate is something that we should look at. So from the backs of those people that are legally meant to be in this country, paying those visa charges, they are then paying money to this immigration detention estate, of which the people they detain, over 70% are actually allowed to be in this country, and some of them are actually allowed to stay in this country. Some of them end up in an indefinite detention situation where they could be there for 1 week, they could be there for over a year, a couple of months or over a year. We see these things happening. For every day they're there, it's over £100. When they're put in hotels, it costs money. When they have the Aspen card, it costs money. And all of these companies that run the immigration detention estate are not doing it out of the goodness of their heart. They're doing it for profit. And when the government claws all of this money from people who are legally meant to be here, what are they doing? They are paying it to these companies, saying that they need to manage this immigration detention estate. And these are some of the same companies that made profit during the pandemic of PPE and all of these different things. So we really do need to think about where this money is actually going. Yes, the Home Office needs money to run, but who is it giving money to run it, and who is that money being taken from? It's all very sinister when you think about it. That money has been taken from one group of migrants to effectually cause a really horrible and inhumane situation for other migrants, whilst a company makes a profit off it. And when I think about, and I'll finish on this. So when I think about some of my colleagues speaking in the House of Commons, well, you know what, we need to think about, if we do reduce these fees, where would we get the money from? And you know, they speak in very, very posh voices and talk about the economy, but they clearly don't understand an economy, because the reality of the situation is, if there are people here that are working, they pay into the tax system. If they have more money, guess what? They go out and, you know, they might have a nice evening out, paying into the economy. They might buy more things, paying into the economy. They might do a whole range of things that they wouldn't have to do if they weren't suffering from a cost of living crisis, simply because they had the means to do so. All of these things grow the economy, not people giving money to private companies, their mates, who eventually take the money offshore to some bank account and profit in that way. And the idea that, you know, well, we shouldn't be encouraging too many people to come here. Who is going to do the jobs? You've heard about the shortages in our NHS, in social care, in many different sectors. We need migrant workers, but if we don't treat them fairly, of course they're going to go somewhere else, because everywhere else has realised that they need migrant workers. Something that people aren't talking about is actually that the birth rate is dropping in this country. And we have an increasingly ageing population. In some schools in my area, we're going to have to actually close some forms of entry in as few as 6 years, simply because the birth rate is dropping. Who is going to work in this country? We need people in this country. And if we're going to have people come to this country, it has to be fair for their families, it has to be fair for them, we need to be treating them properly, and above all, we shouldn't be profiting for people whilst they are suffering in such an awful, awful way. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much. Brilliant. Thank you. Thank you. I mean, I agree with you, and I think a lot of those policies, they target people with a certain color. I mean, I remember a few years back, someone, a black young man, a British person, was stopped at the airport and detained to be deported. And he called us, and I said, but we work with migrants, you're British. He said, yeah, they don't believe I'm British. So you have to call his father, who went and proved he is British. So, yeah. But I want to end it before I open to the floor a few minutes. Sorry, we are running a few minutes late. I hope people don't mind staying a few more minutes. Two women who I met in one of the meetings, one of them, she learned she has a twin. She was pregnant. And, you know, usually excited looking, you know, for having a baby, but then when she heard they're twins, she became so depressed, so worried, so concerned. She said, how will I be able to afford their visa, the cost of their visa? Because she has to pay for each baby. I mean, this is a mother who should be the happiest, you know, time of her life. She's worried about, oh my God, they're now a burden. My babies are going to be a burden. Would I be able to afford? Another mother at that day, she said, you know what, I can't afford to work in UK anymore, because all my salary, they're going on rent, on taxes, on fees and processes, because as mentioned earlier, This costing doesn't include paying legal fees to solicitors, because some people get it wrong and they're worried about getting it wrong. It's a huge amount of money to lose. So you end up paying lots of money to a solicitor to do it right for you. Because if you submit the wrong form or the wrong information, no one will tell you what form to submit and what is the wrong information. So you lose lots of money. So she said, we don't go out as a family. We eat very little. I go find little cheap, food, the cheapest food. We're not buying clothes. I can't go on holiday. I just can't afford to work here anymore. I'm on my way out. So, this is a process that's actually making people who are coming here to work and support us, making them poor on purpose. If someone comes to work and pay taxes, but this is a policy that makes them poor. It's enough of me, but I'm happy to invite colleagues to make a comment or to ask any question to the panelists. If we maybe get three contributions from the floor, if people are happy to. Okay, let's start then to the front, then to the back.